My name is Dr. Brandon Simonson of Boston University, and I'm the Information Officer on the American Name Society Executive Council. And I'm here to introduce two exciting presentations ahead of us this evening for our presenters. Our first speaker today for this session is Justyna Walkowiak. Professor Dr. Walkowiak is a linguist and onomastician who works as associate professor at Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznan, Poland. Professor Dr. Walkowiak co-edited 4 volumes, authored 2 monographs, 2 university course books, and over 40 journal articles and book chapters. Professor Dr. Walkowiak is the section editor of the Polish Journal of Onomastica and co-editor of the proceedings of the 27th ICOS. The title of her paper today is Topohodonyms. Topohodonyms. What are they? Why study them? And how to? Over to you, Professor Dr. Walkowiak.
It's a pleasure to speak to you today. My name is Justyna Walkowiak. I'm employed as associate professor at Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznań. My hometown is a city in the west of Poland, which is relevant insofar as I'm going to invoke examples from its cityscape in my presentation. The topic of my presentation will be topohodonyms, which is a term that I invented on the basis of the terminology already used by researchers who study proper names, that is, onomasticians. Let me first discuss some basic terminology. We are all, I think, familiar with the basic division of proper names into the names of people, that is anthroponyms, the names of places, toponyms, and the remainder comprising mostly what many scholars call crematonyms. The names of places, which are of interest to us now, are also called toponyms. Among them, there are hodonyms, or simply put, names of routes by whichever name they must come, or to put it differently, by whichever generic element. It could be a street, road, via, rue, Strasse, depending on its characteristics and also, of course, on the language. Typically in such names, there is also the specific element that tells us which street or alley it is, such as Sesame in Sesame Street, Abbey in Abbey Road, Appia in Via Appia, Saint-Denis in Rue Saint-Denis, Frankfurter in Frankfurter Strasse, and so on. Now there are many types of specific elements. It could be names of famous people in commemorative street names. It could be appellatives, that is common nouns, in such hodonyms as Church Street or Unter den Linden. But of interest for us today, it could also be toponyms of any kind, as you can see. It could be names of cities, towns, even of small villages, why not? Of whole regions or countries, names of rivers, of lakes, as well of mountains or the whole ranges. Now, why are they so special? Why study them? Well, in Central Europe, where I come from, emotional, heated debates and renamings usually involve the commemoration of people and perhaps also those street names that honor some historical events, such as battles. Topohodonyms are seldom seen as controversial. In fact, they seem anything but. They sort of nicely melt into the background. Yet they are not as ideologically innocent as they might at first glance appear. Another reason is they are rather numerous. In Poznań, they constitute about 2/3 of the contemporary total of over 2,500 streets. In Warsaw, as you can see, they constitute about 1/4 of the total, but in any case, they are quite numerous. And moreover, the toponyms that the street names refer to are not quite accidental. A closer look, and most of all some serious literature research, indicates that the decision makers who stand behind their choice sometimes tended to be very purposeful in their actions. You might think that it was mere chance, but no, not necessarily. And I will show you why using examples. For instance, when in the aftermath of the Second World War, Poland was granted the eastern borderlands of pre-war Germany in compensation of the territories lost to the Soviet Union in the east. Among others, street names had to change. In Wrocław, the German name is Breslau, former German name, had to change from German to Polish ones. Some names were merely translated, while others had to go. And in particular, the street names that referenced German towns handed over to Poland remained, only in their Polish translation, while those motivated by the names of towns that were to remain in Germany had to disappear. The only exception, interestingly, was topohodonyms motivated by the Slavic forms of place names in Lusatia, which is in the east of the former German Democratic Republic, now the eastern part of the United Germany. They remained, first because there was still hope that they might become part of Poland, and second because they were intentionally kept in street names in their Slavic linguistic form and not in the German one. Another interesting example can be found in a recent study by Fabiszak et al. In the west of Poland, there is a small town of Zbąszyn. When in 1918 Poland regained independence after well over a century of partitions, the town's street names had to be Polonized. As regards one of its topohodonyms, Neutomyślstrasse, which means literally Nowy Tomyśl Street, Nowy Tomyśl being another little town in the vicinity, it would have been enough to simply translate its name into Nowotomyska, Nowy Tomyśl Street. Because it was a directional name, the street simply led to Nowy Tomyśl, which came to Poland. But what was done instead was a change to Warszawska, literally Warsaw Street. The reason was probably, and we can only offer an educated guess here, that this was meant to symbolically link the town to Warsaw, the capital of Poland, so as to emphasize that it was now Polish. Okay, let us now see how we can categorize topohodonyms. This could be done along various dimensions. For example, the namesake, that is to say, the toponym motivating a street name, could be native or foreign or even global. Regarding the native ones, there might be different degrees of their locality. Foreign ones could be some specific towns in neighboring countries, chosen for some political reason, for instance, or some archetypal, global, internationally known cities, such as Paris, Venice, or New York, for instance. Next, topohodonyms could be individual occurrences dispersed over a city, or they could be gathered in clusters, sort of thematic nests, as you can see on this map of Berlin on the left. And finally, there is the question of motivation. Now, there are two basic types of motivation. We can have toponyms or topohodonyms motivated in the onomastic sense of the word, which means that there is a historical reason why a particular street was named the way it was. For instance, maybe immigrants from some town lived in that street, or maybe the road led to a particular town, so it would be a directional name, or maybe a village was absorbed by the city and its name remained in the name of the street that is now situated in the same place. So that would be a causative explanation referring to a past reason. And secondly, there are names unmotivated in the onomastic sense, that is conventional or arbitrary, if you will, with no relationship to the town or the city commemorated. But there was usually some aim in naming. It could be either manifestation of regional identity or a show of national unity, national narration, or maybe the wish to honor a political ally, or perhaps a nostalgic reason, referring to a lost territory. In any case, it would be a teleological explanation, that is to say, explanation focused on the aim rather than the past reason. Okay, and our final question is how to study topohodonyms. What patterns can we expect to reveal? I came up with 3 ideas that I will call respectively the dot method, distance analysis, and finally quantitative analysis. I will show you first my dot analysis of Poznan. As you can see, I came up with this acronym myself, DOT. I mean DOT to stand for dispersion of toponyms. Okay, on the left, you can see the mapping of the topohodonyms of Poznan in the interwar period, that is in the 1930s. At the time, there were about 115 topohodonyms in Poznan. And as you can see, most of the places that they referred to are contained within the country borders of the time. There are very few dots beyond these limits. Most are contained within the borders. And on the right, by contrast, you can see the cityscape of towns and cities referenced in the topohodonyms present in Poznan shortly before the end of the Nazi German occupation of Poland in 1940s. There were jointly 286 topohodonyms, which is over twice as many as in the pre-war city. This is explainable because over the 6 years of occupation, Germans marked out many new streets and roads, and they named them. So it's visible that the town and cities they commemorate are dispersed over a far larger area that comprises, first of all of the Third Reich, but also the Baltic countries, where the Baltic Germans were living at the time. Today it's Latvia and Estonia, and in the West, the Netherlands, and also some places in Czechia, and even a bit of Italy, which was Hitler's ally at the time. So the mental horizon is much wider. And clearly we deal here with the territorial claims staked. We have to remember from the methodological point of view that this only depicts towns, cities, and rivers, occasionally also mountain peaks. And all these can be represented on a map as points and occasionally as lines in the case of rivers. But there were also topohodonyms commemorating geographical regions or mountain ranges, which are spaces, and their graphic representation would not look so neat. But that's a bit of a problem, but we can always discuss them verbally in the text, not present them on a map. And there were typically not as many of them as those referring to towns and cities. And in any case, the location of these spaces was also consistent, was found to be consistent with the narration that was weaved by the points and lines. Let us have a look now at some historical background in order to go on. As a result of territorial losses to the Soviet Union in consequence of the Second World War and of territorial gains in the West, Poland was sort of physically moved to the West in 1945. The gray area marks the losses, and the gains, territorial gains, are shown in pink. And now, armed with this knowledge, we can move on to another comparison. And this time, the topohodonyms from Poznan under German occupation will be compared with the contemporary city. Today, there are nearly 650 topohodonyms of interest for us in Poznan, and it's clearly visible that the highest concentration of dots can be found just like in pre-war times within the state borders, only the new state borders this time. However, there are some outliers. Dots to the east of the border are mostly carryovers from the pre-war past, and they now serve as some sort of nostalgic reminder of the lost glory, as it were. And something interesting can also be seen in the West, in the former German Democratic Republic. Nearly all of these streets were named in 1946, directly after the war. And they commemorate villages, sometimes small villages or rivers in Germany, but in the Slavic language version of name, sometimes actually attested names, but often merely reconstructed, which are not certain, which is not certain if they ever existed in this form. Directly after the end of the war, this was a kind of political statement. Look, there are Slavs in Germany. And today, the inhabitants of Poznan typically don't recognize at all the toponyms hidden in these names. And some people even tend to think that these street names might be referencing Russian cities. In fact, I wonder if these topohodonyms were ever semantically transparent to anyone apart from the narrow circle of their namers. And let us now move to the distance analysis, my second idea for topohodonymic research. It is quite simple, actually. By measuring distances and then adding them, we can calculate the average distance. Here we have to do with a geographical mental horizon, if you will. So how distant your points of reference are from your hometown, in this case from Poznan, speaks volumes about your geopolitical perspective. Research similar to mine, comparing these distances under Nazi occupation and in communist times in East Germany, proved a similar shrinkage of perspective, as you can see in the quotation that I displayed on the left. And finally, quantitative analysis, which is just numbers without going into details of particular towns or cities. Now, my focus this time is Radom, a town somewhat smaller than Poznan, but also situated in a more central, less ethnically contested part of Poland, and the area that might be termed the backbone of historical Poland. What you can see here is the outline of contemporary country with its 16 main administrative units called voivodeships. Here I simply calculated and superimposed on the map the number of places commemorated in the names of the streets of Radom in each voivodeship. As you can see, Radom is very local, which means the closer to home, the more places are referenced. This can be seen on a larger scale and also on a smaller scale. On the scale of only the voivodeship where it's located, subdivided into counties. And again, we can see a very high focus on the local. That's not to say that no areas abroad are referenced at all, because there are 10 cities of Europe, but I would call it global naming. These names are simply symbolic of foreign prestigious location, like London, Madrid, Rome, Vienna, or Geneva. Might be more to do with gentrification than with real national affinities. So, to sum up, the approach I'm proposing has its merits and drawbacks. Limitations first, it works best for street names that are strictly commemorative. As we saw on the example of pseudo-Russian and in fact Slavic names in Germany, the original motivation, the historical reason for naming, may with time be forgotten, which is another methodological problem. Finally, the cities whose streets are compared may be incompatible in size, and that's yet another issue that we have to deal with. And most importantly, the procedure takes a lot of time. But this said, we can say on the plus side that it's definitely a great tool for comparisons, and these comparisons can be both synchronic and diachronic. And these methods may help us identify certain patterns and policies in street naming, provide insight into national affinities, into mental points of reference, and reveal a lot of new ideas about how our streets are named. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Walkowiak, for such a fascinating presentation on topohodonyms. I'm going to get the pronunciation right eventually here, but I think it's just an absolutely fascinating term that you've coined here, and I think it does just an excellent work identifying with some precision this phenomenon that you find. I think what really stood out to me at first is when you mentioned this sort of perceived ideological innocence. I spent a lot of time living in Tel Aviv in Israel, and I would occasionally commute to Jerusalem to spend time at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and that is certainly a city with changing names. We find road names with that have Hebrew names, that have Arabic names, that have even sort of Christian interpolations that are added later to sort of mark a kind of event that happened in that place according to these various religious traditions. I wonder if you could speak more about that sort of ideological innocence that is sort of perceived with these names, and how these roads can actually tell quite a different story when we think about the sort of intention behind those names.
Right. Well, first of all, I'd say that probably it depends on which particular towns or cities or rivers are commemorated, and this is the first level, I'd say, and that's sort of obvious where these places are. Secondly, since you mentioned Israel, I would venture a guess. I'm not quite sure. I don't know much about the hodonymy of that country, other than I can vaguely remember a funny, an amusing story by Ephraim Kishon, I think, about changing street names and the resulting confusion. But that was a satire, I think. And obviously Maos Azariahu, but that he was writing. I'm not sure if he actually wrote about your city, or was it Haifa? Oh, I'm not quite sure right now. But in any case, the second level would be probably the language in which these names are included in the hodonyms, the language versions. This is also, I think, some sort of particular, political statement, power relations, expressing power relations, definitely. And another thing that maybe does not tie directly with Israel as such, but what I have noticed reading about some hodonyms in Canada, where you sort of look to for, I don't know, inspiration, for cultural context, which places are important to you. Well, I was surprised, for instance, how many British towns and cities are referenced in the street names of some Canadian cities. Probably quite many for a, well, let's face it, for a foreign country these days. It was also interesting for me to see that, for instance, we have more or less 4 times as many Paris streets in Poland than we have Berlin streets. And that must be for a particular reason to do with political affinities historically. I'm not quite sure if that answers your question.
It does. Thank you so much. I've got a question in the chat, but on
Go
that
ahead.
note, even here in New England, I'm in Concord, Massachusetts. We have, I mean, so many British names, despite the
Precisely.
fact that this is where that sort of Revolutionary War happened. Even here, where I live is not very far from where those first battles took place, and we have some very British sort of influenced names, and I can think of a
Precisely.
few topohodonyms as well that are distinctly British here in America. So
Right.
we do have a question in the chat I'll read from Chris Davini. Thank you for this presentation. With the importance of the linguistic landscape in contemporary studies, your material is enlightening. If my question is within the span of your study, could you comment on where, Could you comment on where and how these names appear? And are they on street signs? Are they marked on local maps, etc.? Thank you.
Well, to begin with the end, yeah, obviously they are on street signs and they are also on city maps. And they are, well, they are used in addresses, as could be expected. Well, they are ubiquitous and rather consistent. And well, the reasons are historical. But in the case of Poznan, a large proportion is commemorative simply. That's to say, we meant to immortalize particular places and not some other ones. And that's this century, the 20th century thing, basically.
Thank you very much. We have another question in the chat here from Cleveland Evans. In the USA, there are many newer sections of cities where names of streets have been chosen by real estate developers, and sometimes they choose names from places in other countries that Americans have romantic stereotypes of. There is a section of Ann Arbor, Michigan, where the developer named the streets after names of places he saw on street signs while on a vacation in England. Does this ever happen in newly developed neighborhoods in Poland?
Well, thank you. That's a very interesting question. And I hope that I'm able to answer in a satisfactory way. Well, two ideas come to mind just on just at first glance. One is an example from my hometown, which is a sort of attempt at gentrification. Before the war, the Second World War, we used to have a kind of social district for with cheap buildings for the unemployed and for the poor, for the needy. And the names until pretty recently the streets had no names until a few years ago. Even though it was, well, actually when this area was built, when these houses were constructed, it was the late 30s. I think it was the Great Crisis. And a few years ago, they suddenly, out of the blue, received names, and they were very sophisticated names, like referencing a well-known and prestigious, I'd say, regions in Europe. Like there was Provence, Tuscany, there was some regions of Spain. So very, very, I would say, very prestigious locations. And another thing, it's to do with a developer in Warsaw. Recently, a few years ago, I think they are still in the process of construction. There is a district in Warsaw that references the Polish presence in Lithuania. And there are some streets referring to some places in Vilnius, for instance. And this is evidently done for the money in order to attract people who feel sentimental about Vilnius belonging to Poland before the Second World War. And that's all there is said. Well, this is not laudable, I'm afraid.
Thank you very much for your response. Are there any other questions from the audience? You can feel free if you'd like to raise your hand or type one into the chat.
Well, if I can just comment, this is Grant Smith, and
I can hear.
the developments that we have in this region, which is far out west, reference nature quite a bit. A lot of nature references. Now, and that's kind of like Cleve Evans's observation about the idealization of development names. But it's, I think, very specifically references to nature to give the impression of wooded areas or streams and peace and comfort. So it would be interesting to compare, I think, the various regions with those references to show I would guess, big differences, for instance, from Europe, where there is much more contact between countries and cultures. Yes, back east, I can imagine that there might be street names that reference England a bit more than out west here. So that's just a comment more than a question. A very impressionistic comment.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Grant. It was a pleasure to listen to your comment. Well, a disclaimer is that it's not very typical, the district in Warsaw that I mentioned. I think most of our developers are clever enough to offer names like Pleasant Street, Nice Street, that kind of thing, Flower Street, something safe and non-controversial, that's for sure. It was a one-off that I mentioned in Warsaw. I think they are not very typical, but they do happen.
We have the development nearby here. It's called Golden Hills.
Precisely.
Yes.
Yes, we definitely have our equivalents of Golden Hills, whatever color they are, definitely. Right. Quite many.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Professor Dr. Walkowiak. Just an excellent start to our afternoon. We also have thanks in the chat as well for your presentation. So we all very much appreciate it.